Ms Graham.
Thank you. Lady Angiolini, before lunch we were talking about your 2020 report, and I wonder if I can ask you to look at Chapter 7, and in particular, let's begin with paragraph 7.4, which is found on page 82 of the PDF, but is actually page 81 of the report itself. And paragraph 7.4 relates to the Police Professional Standards Department. 7.4, please.
Yes, got that.
Yes. And you talk about, and we've heard evidence about the involvement of the Professional Standards Department within issues of conduct. And in fact, you also mention, if we can go on to page 82, you specifically mention the Police Service of Scotland Conduct Regulations 2014. Are those the regulations that you had regard to when you were preparing your report?
I assume they were. I can't remember now, but I must have, would have thought.
Thank you. And can we look at paragraph 7.57, please? And again, you come back to the question of independence here. 7.57, a common theme in the course of my review has been expression of concern about the concept of the police investigating the police when a complaint is made about their service or conduct. This was succinctly put by one member of the public who told me that people who investigate themselves don't tend to find themselves guilty. Do you see that paragraph 7.57?
7.57. It's much further on, is it? Yeah.
Yes, it's 57, 7.57, and it's on.
Yes, that's right.
I have it on. Excellent, thank you. And again, in going back to this question of independence, did you talk about a common theme? Was this a concern not just in relation to investigations into deaths, but also investigations into the conduct of police officers?
Yes. Yes.
And can we look, please, at paragraph 7.60? And do we see again that you refer to the 5 principles in relation to Article 2 under the European Convention of Human Rights, and independence is mentioned there. And then at 7.61, you mention the other principles, including adequacy, promptness, public scrutiny, and victim involvement. And again, was this very much through the prism of Article 2 that you considered questions relating to conduct and complaints?
Yes. Yes.
And can we look at your recommendations, please? These are on page 123 of the actual report, at page 124 of the PDF. So paragraph 7.143. And do we see there the recommendations in this report are in bold at the end of each chapter?
Yes.
And this says, other than for pressing operational reasons, police officers involved in a death in custody or serious incident, whether as principal officers or witnesses to the incident, should not confer or speak to each other following that incident, and prior to producing their initial accounts and statements on any matter concerning their individual recollections of the incident, even about seemingly minor details. As with civilian witnesses, all statements should be the honestly held recollection of the individual officer. And I appreciate that in your previous report, the 2017 report, and also in this report, you have commented in relation to conferral. Having considered all matters regarding conferral, was this your final conclusion that there should not be conferral if there has been a death in custody or, for example, a death after police contact?
Yes. I think I give the caveat there that if they're in isolated circumstances or that there is some pressing reason that they have to speak, then clearly health and safety, etc., might demand that can't be obtempered in full, but where it's practicable and reasonable, then they should be separated and their statements taken just as civilian witnesses would be approached by the police, and they would not take their statements together. And I also think that this provision is there to actually protect police in a sense from themselves, because even if they haven't thought about it then, the fact that they're left together for a significant amount of time chatting about it, or even if they claim they haven't, it's a bit like throwing a skunk in the room and asking people not to smell it. It doesn't really assist them. I think this is a better way of protecting the evidence and also their own genuine recollections.
So as much for the benefit of the officers themselves
Exactly.
as the public perception that may exist if they are permitted to confer.
Yes, yes.
And can we move on to paragraph 7.153? And this is on the PDF at page 125, but I think it's 124 of the actual report.
Yes.
And this recommendation is the Scottish Government should consider the case for giving the PERC a specific legislative power that would enable staff to access the Centurion database from its own offices so that contemporaneous audit is possible. Providing a basis in law for accessing any information relevant to the PERC's statutory functions should ensure compatibility with GDPR and any other relevant data protection legislation. Now, we've heard evidence that the Centurion database is one used by Police Scotland. Is that the database that's referred to here?
Yes.
And we've also heard evidence that PERC, in the past certainly, may have had to request that checks of the database are carried out by police officers. Was this recommendation designed to avoid that potential conflict of interest, that potential attack on independence of PERC's investigation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
And then can we move on to Chapter 8, please? And in particular, paragraph 8.16. And you'll see that this is a recommendation in bold. It's on page 129 of the actual report.
Oh, yes, I've got it. Yeah.
Police Scotland's executive team should consider in depth and review the criteria and competencies. Oh, sorry, I've got the wrong number here. It's not this one that I was wanting. It was, sorry, page 130.
Yes.
Chapter 9, complaints in the context of inclusion, diversity and discrimination. And we actually very briefly touched on that just before lunch, although at that stage I didn't have the terms of the report quite in front of me. And we are hoping to hear evidence later in the inquiry from two other witnesses. One is called Steve Allen, and one is Sandra DeLond Clark, who's the chair of SEMPER. I think I've already mentioned her name. Steve Allen, as I understand it, may give evidence to the inquiry that he was of the view that there was a missed opportunity to embed a cultural commitment to equality and diversity during the transition to Police Scotland. And that was when they moved from the legacy forces and Police Scotland was created on the 1st of April 2013. And I wondered, first of all, whether you would have any thoughts about that, that there was a missed opportunity to truly embed a cultural commitment to equality and diversity in Police Scotland in 2013.
And does he mean by there being a specific reference to that in the constitution of the new force? I'm not quite sure. where did he propose that should be contained?
I don't have his evidence in front of me. We hope to hear further evidence from Mr. Allen about these matters. We do have a statement from him, but we don't have the full details.
Just in general, I think, yes, it would have been a really good opportunity. It would have been a very positive statement, and I think it would have been a good juncture at that point where you have this new force, and to have that up front. It's not something which I don't know if I came after before that, but I certainly think that would have been it's presumably still something they could do.
I was going to ask you that. Does anything in your report suggest that it would be too late for improvements to be made by Police Scotland? We've heard of an action plan that exists and attempts that are being made to improve the culture within Police Scotland in terms of equality, diversity, inclusion. Was there anything in your report to suggest that wouldn't be a worthwhile endeavour?
No, because every year you've got a different audience. You've got, the different citizens, different kids growing up, and different people applying to the police. And I think something as bold as that, right up front, about what they're about, sends out a powerful message, and also encourages a much more diverse group of people applying to apply for the role. Thank you.
And you've mentioned Semper, and as I've said, we hope to hear from Sandra Dillon-Clark later in the inquiry. I understand she may give evidence that Semper were not approached to discuss embedding a better culture of equality and diversity in Police Scotland when it was created. Did you have any impression from your dealings with Semper, those from Semper, as to the benefit of including them with discussions about improvements that can be made?
Discussions with the police when it was being established?
Yes.
I found them very, very helpful and knowledgeable about these issues, and I think it could only have been beneficial.
Thank you. Could we look, please, at Chapter 9 on complaints? Now, I have that on the screen in front of me, complaints in the context of inclusion, diversity and discrimination. If we look at paragraph 9.1, you say the way any organisation responds to complaints and the character of its internal culture are both important indicators of the maturity, health and effectiveness of that organisation. This can be observed in the commercial context as well as in public entities. Listening and responding effectively to complaints and crucially learning the implications of what those complaints indicate are excellent mechanisms for improving the quality of the service provided. We've heard some suggestions of perhaps, at one time at least, perhaps not now, of defensiveness and protectiveness on the part of the police when complaints are tendered or made by members of the public in particular. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the tension between and perhaps the reaction of defensiveness or protectiveness when a complaint is made, but also an organisation, a mature organisation, learning lessons and moving forward in a constructive way. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I agree with the proposition. I used to work way back in the dark ages as a sales assistant with Marks and Spencer's. This is not a commercial interlude for them, but I was always found it incredible how they genuinely welcomed complaints, because they were, in terms of their commercial imperative, because it's how they learn. And even if it's a difficult one, it should be a feeling of, oh, thank goodness we know about it, and what can we do to prevent this recurring? And so complaints are a really important aspect of a learning culture in any organisation and improvement.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraph 9.5? So it's not 9.50, it's 9.5.
Yeah.
And here we are. The evidence suggests that some officers and staff experience discriminatory conduct, attitudes, behaviours and microaggressions, both internally and externally in the course of their duties. We heard that many of these incidents go unreported, even though some of these behaviours constitute misconduct, and that there was a reluctance in these Black, Asian and minority ethnic officers to report for fear of being characterised as, and in quotes, playing the race card.
Yeah.
I wondered, particularly as you mentioned microaggressions, that these are going unreported, although some may constitute misconduct. And I'm interested in the evidence that you gathered that allowed you to draw out this conclusion.
I think there were elements of being left out of a night out, not include, just not included, or folk going for a drink after work, or there'd be some sort of tournament on or something and find themselves just not included in these things, and there wasn't. I didn't ever get a sense of overt mockery or anything, but just a sense of finding it difficult to get sometimes into friendship groups within the organisation.
And was it did you have any views about what the organisation itself could do to promote friendship groups and inclusion for others within friendship groups or events that are being arranged?
Well, yes, in the sense if you have them, it's more I suppose supervisors and bosses, if they're going to, sometimes people invite folks to their house, making sure that, always inviting all staff and not excluding people from those events. But I again think that the cultural issues were just psychological barriers for some individuals, that they just didn't see what they would have in common in their lives, because if someone was a Muslim, they wouldn't want to drink, or they might. And again, it's a lot of it was an absence of interest in others, and or expanding your friendships circle to people who have got really so much to offer. And I think that I'm not sure if that's still a common feature. I hope it's not. But again, I suppose people are drawn to very often those who are similar to themselves. And that doesn't augur well in terms of really having a diverse and fully integrated society where everyone feels comfortable to be themselves.
And in particular with things like conduct and microaggressions, if those were reported, was it your expectation that those would be dealt with in terms of the conduct regulations within Police Scotland?
I think I may have said somewhere that there was a feeling that someone would try. I mean, they always have. This isn't just confined to this. If there was a grievance of some description, I think very often the sergeant or the inspector would attempt to mediate over the matter and try and resolve it without going through a formal channel. But they didn't. They did on occasion. But again, it was like a nuclear button making a complaint. So the prospects of these actually happening was another matter.
Can we move on, please, to paragraph 9.10? And this is on page 132 of your report, towards the bottom, page 133 of the PDF. And here you quote from Sir William Macpherson in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, where Sir William wrote, "Unwitting racism can arise because of lack of understanding, ignorance or mistaken beliefs. It can arise from well-intentioned but patronising words or actions. It can arise from unfamiliarity with the behaviour or cultural traditions of people or families from minority ethnic communities. It can arise from racist stereotyping of black people as potential criminals or troublemakers. Often this arises out of uncritical self-understanding, born out of an inflexible police ethos of the traditional way of doing things. Furthermore, such attitudes can thrive in a tightly knit community, so that there can be a collective failure to detect and to outlaw this breed of racism. The police canteen can too easily be the breeding ground. Now, this is obviously a quotation from 1999. To what extent would you say that description matched the description of Police Scotland in 2020 when you did your report?
I think there was still evidence of it. I think that with younger members of the staff, I think it was they were beginning to be much more interested in each other. And I think, again, part of that is progressive. You look at, again, the fact that people are travelling so much, people really enjoy going out for meals from different countries and tasting different cuisines and getting interested. And people have got much more of an appetite to learn about other countries. And then, whereas, if you go back to the 1960s, there just wasn't. There wasn't. Well, we didn't. Many people wouldn't have had the money, but there wasn't the infrastructure for people to travel and to learn more about cultures. As a result of which, I think people are a bit more relaxed. But there are still issues. I don't believe that those issues have disappeared. I still think that there is a challenge for people coming in from a minority community to make friends and to feel comfortable in the whole. They may have one or two, but to feel comfortable in the whole community and really belonging. And that's why there has to be real efforts on the part of not just the supervisors, but all colleagues to make sure that folk feel comfortable and are befriended in the same way they would with others.
Thank you. Could you look at paragraph 9.86, which is on page 153 of your report? And you mentioned here specifically attitudes and behaviours. Discriminatory attitudes and behaviours do exist in Scotland, and they also exist in Police Scotland. That was evident in the discussions that I have had over recent months. The evidence presented to the review in relation to complaints and misconduct matters is that discriminatory attitudes and behaviours are present within Police Scotland, as there are in many organisations, and that such attitudes and behaviours are also exhibited by some members of the public and the way they treat police officers. We have heard much evidence in this inquiry which suggests that many witnesses have never seen or heard or witnessed any discriminatory attitudes or behaviours. But here you say they do exist, both in Scotland and also in Police Scotland. In terms of the evidence that you received and reviewed in preparing for this report, was it evidence to you that there were discriminatory attitudes and behaviours that were present in Police Scotland at that time? Yes.
And again, I'm not surprised that that people say that the complaints weren't made, because that was also probably the reality of it. If you look into another context again with the Wayne Couzens report, there was a WhatsApp group there where the culture was very, totally toxic group of police officers who made vile jokes at the expense of just every minority community they could think of, as well as anyone else who was considered to be not part of their white male group. But I've also seen examples of WhatsApp groups of that nature from police officers in Scotland as well. I haven't seen one which was quite as extreme as that, but certainly they do exist. And I think that, again, technology, WhatsApp groups, etc., allow people to form groups of friends who are like themselves. And again, might add further to the marginalisation of those officers who come from other religions or other traditions or other countries.
And I think another part of your report, you also mentioned senior officers. We have heard evidence from senior officers whether they have seen any discriminatory attitudes and behaviours, whether they've witnessed that, whether they've noticed that in their work. And many have said that that's not something that they're aware of. Is there an issue with regard to senior officers that you noticed when you were preparing your report?
I can't remember now. I can't remember if I did say anything without references. I'm not sure if you can point me to something in the report regarding the attitude of senior officers.
I haven't got the note of it here, but I will
Don't
come
think I
back to
have.
that. From memory, I think you... Well, I'll wait and see if I can find it in my notes.
Okay.
I'll move on at the moment, if I may. I'd like to look at your recommendations under this section, this chapter, page 158, or PDF, page 158, paragraph 9.96.
Yes.
And here, this is a recommendation at the conclusion of Chapter 9. Police Scotland should make use of staff surveys to enhance their understanding of the experience of all minority groups in the service, and senior officers should make more use of face-to-face meetings and focus groups with members of these groups to gain a more acute understanding of the impacts of discrimination, prejudice and unconscious bias. And when you made this recommendation about using staff surveys, what was your expectation about how this would be taken forward? We have heard some evidence about a survey.
That it should happen promptly, and that it would be something which it should be, if not regular, certainly it should be being repeated from time to time. Because it gives the employers a good source of intelligence as to how people are feeling when they might not be content to make absolutely direct complaints or oral complaints to people about what's happening.
So would you
expect?
Sorry, I interrupted.
No,
was your expectation that this survey would be a source of data which would be repeated over a period,
Yes.
an extended period, to provide, again, you talked earlier about identifying patterns or hotspots or issues. Is that the type of thing you would expect to be done?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And then if we can look at 9.99.
Can I also add just to that answer that it's particularly important in an organisation where people are not always together for the same people, who are outside, who may only come together in the morning, get their shift instructions from the sergeant and then disappear off around the town, etc. So their experiences can be quite different, and that in itself can also be quite isolating. So I think that was another reason why that was really important.
Dealing with recommendation 9.99 first, in the light of the very worrying evidence that I have received, I consider that issues related to discrimination and their impact on public confidence in Police Scotland should be the subject of a broader, fundamental review of equality matters by an independent organisation. That review should take into account HMIC's proposed inspection of training and development, that is to concentrate on the recruitment, retention, development and promotion of underrepresented groups. Was it your view, in light of all the evidence, you described very worrying evidence that you heard, that a further review should also be carried out, specifically regarding equality matters?
Yes.
And you say that that should be by an independent organisation? Again, not by Police Scotland itself?
No.
Was that with a view to, well, you've made comments regarding Article 2 and the importance of independence. and removing that potential conflict of interest, was that with a view to it being truly independent?
Yes.
Perhaps we could very briefly go back to paragraph 9.53. Thank you. And you say, during the focus group, the review was told that Black, Asian and minority ethnic officers are the subject of more complaints from the public than any other officers, and it was felt the onus tended to be on the officer to defend themselves when a complaint was made. A more extensive support network and more understanding from senior officers would be helpful. It was also noted that currently there is a lack of Black, Asian or minority ethnic officers in the Professional Standards Department. And what was envisaged here when you talk about a more extensive support network and more understanding from senior officers?
Police officers can be abused in the streets, but if you come from a minority community, if you're Black, then you are subject to not just the public derision for being a police officer, but also again for being Black, and so they're dealing with a double aspect of potential abuse from nasty members of the public that other officers are also having to experience, but it's intensified and even more personal in a sense and hurtful because of that.
So if
I could just add that it's a term of abuse to which I've heard used that police officers are shouted when they're shouted at in a derogatory fashion, that they're shouted at and called black bastards, even when they're not Black or from a minority community, which again might say something about the mindset.
So in light of the reality of the discriminatory attitudes that they may face in their
Yes.
daily work, in recognition of that, do you consider that a more extensive network of support and more understanding from senior officers would help to minimise the impact of that discrimination which is being faced? Yes.
Yes, because we're asking a lot of these officers.
Thank you. Can I ask you about something that's been described as review fatigue? You've obviously referred to the report by Sir William Macpherson in relation to the Stephen Lawrence murder. You have mentioned yourself about the number of reviews that have been carried out. I've talked very briefly and highlighted references that you've made to the deaths in custody of various Black men, Sean Riggs and Christopher Alder, for example. We've talked about those this morning. Is there any reflections that you could provide to the chair to assist him in reflecting on review fatigue, that we can see themes emerging from the Macpherson report that are perhaps repeated in subsequent reports, and issues that you have continued to see in 2017 and that you mention in your 2020 report? Do you have any thoughts about dealing with review fatigue?
Well, part of the problem is who reads them, because they go to organisations with responsibility for influencing, reporting on and employing their employees, and therefore it should really affect the way that they move forward. Despite the fact that things look, if you look at these reports, you think, well, it still looks pretty grim. I still think it's probably incrementally getting better than it was, say, 50 years ago. Because we look back many, many years ago, it was, people who were Catholic couldn't get jobs. You've got these prejudices which have been evident in Scottish society and culture for a number of years, and every one of them has to be addressed, not only for the sake of what's happening, but also historically about our society and how we're developing. Because in the future, it's what we learn a lot from what's happened in the past. So I think there is a value from those in terms of recording the historical difficulties that we've had in trying to give people the freedoms and rights that they're entitled to enjoy as citizens. And I think that this is part of that wider process. I also think that there are immediate changes, because I know the chief constables in the past have not wanted to have organisations where there are these issues, and have actually wanted to find these reports to be helpful to take those forward, when in fact that they're not having the effect within their own organisation, when it's someone coming from outside and looking at it objectively.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to your most recent report, which we touched on earlier. This was from February of this year, and it was the first part of the Angiolini report. And let me just get the reference number. It's already on the screen. It's SBPI 00632. And this is part one of your report in this matter.
Yes.
And I think if we turn to the very beginning of the report, Roman numeral page 3, and this is the foreword. There we are. And you begin with a quote from the mother of Sarah Everard, and then you explain that part one of this independent inquiry was commissioned in late 2021 by the then Home Secretary to establish a definitive account of the career and conduct of the individual responsible for the premeditated and brutal murder of Sarah Everard. And this report focuses on her assailant. You have, however, always been conscious that this focus can create a perception of Sarah being marginalised from the whole process. But you have, in this inquiry, sought evidence and understanding of the actions. And so was this a report which was commissioned from you by the then Home Secretary to look into these circumstances?
Yes.
And if we can look at page 4, Roman numeral, sorry, page 4. And under Angiolini inquiry, the second paragraph under that heading, the terms of reference were announced in May 2023. These were informed by the work of the inquiry in part 1, as well as by submissions received as part of a public consultation on the terms of reference for part 2. The scope of part 2 includes the recruitment and vetting of police officers, culture and standards in policing, and measures to help prevent sexually motivated violence against women in public spaces. And the work for this part of the inquiry is ongoing. And am I right in saying that at some point there will be a second part of this report, which will also include your thoughts on police culture and standards in policing? Is that correct?
Yes, as well as a separate report on a colleague of Wayne Couzens who was serving in the same unit, David Carrick, who was jailed for, I think it's a whole life sentence for the rape of a number of women.
And in terms of your ongoing work, Lady Angiolini, would you anticipate that this second report and the other report you mention may also contain some interesting and perhaps relevant comments on police culture and standards, which the Chair
Yes.
could consider? Thank you.
Yes.
And would it be asking too much to ask when you anticipate that may be available?
I think end of 25, 20, and beginning of 26, because there are, as you'll see, there's another Wayne Couzens report to do with David Carrick. He's a very prolific offender, so there's an awful lot to look into that as well as, but they are running in parallel. So certainly, I think as soon as possible, because I do hope to retire.
All right, thank you very much. Could we look, please, at Chapter 7 in this report, the Angiolini report? And this is on page 278, or PDF page 292. And I think if we look at paragraph 7.2, with time, the bad apple theory has been recognised as false. While giving evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee in April 2022 and answering the question, is it the culture of the Met that is the problem? Sir Stephen House, then Acting Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Service, admitted, "It is not a few bad apples. You cannot simply say that Wayne Couzens and a couple of other people have done something wrong. I would suggest that that has been the spearhead of the problem. But there is a wider issue within the organisation which we acknowledge and we are dealing with." I'm interested in your own reflections on the idea of a bad apple, and where that sometimes is said in connection with officers who have perhaps failed to meet the standards of professional behaviour on which one would expect them to comply. Do you have your own thoughts about this idea of it's just a few bad apples, or it's just a bad apple?
Yes, because it's evidently not. And every working day for the last 2 years, I received a summary of all of the press and television news reports which relate to offences committed by police officers. And it makes very depressing reading. There are so many really good police officers, very good men and women out there and utterly dedicated to public safety. Having these people working in there with them is not good for them. It's not good for the public. And there really is an urgent need to rid policing of a significant number of people who are in there for their own purposes and not the public interest, and who use the power that they have acquired to abuse members of the public and sometimes their own colleagues.
Thank you. Can we look, please, at your recommendation number 14 on the workplace culture chapter at 326? And this is page 340 on the PDF.
Yes.
And here you say, positive culture and an elimination of misconduct or criminality often excused as banter. So this is page 326 of this report, and it's underneath 7199. So if you keep moving up the page, that's it. Thank you. And it reads, with immediate effect, every police force should commit publicly to being an anti-sexist, anti-misogynistic, anti-racist organisation in order to address, understand and eradicate sexism, racism and misogyny, contributing to a wider positive culture to remove all forms of discrimination from the profession. This includes properly addressing and taking steps to root out so-called banter that often veils or excuses malign or toxic behaviour in police ranks. And in terms of this recommendation, would you care to expand in any way on what you've said here about the importance of an organisation becoming anti-racist?
The reality is that that policing requires people to rely on their colleagues, and so they form bonds. So you're looking, if you have to go out into a dangerous situation, you're hoping that your workmates will keep an eye out for you and support you if you get yourself in trouble, and therefore their relationships are important, and sometimes they are traumatized or whatever, and a common method for dealing with that is finding camaraderie and solace in groups where they go together. Maybe they might go for a drink, or they might have these WhatsApp groups where they swap stories about their families or what their hobbies are, etc., or have a laugh, exchange jokes. However, the pattern is that I've been seeing in the current or in the initial report, which you'll see there, was the existence of particular groups which were highly toxic and not body humour, absolutely thoroughly disgusting humour, which evidenced all of these prejudices as a joke, and comprehensive bigotry towards anyone who was a minority, and so that in itself is criminal. It is criminal behaviour. It's not just banter. It is a crime. And the Lord Justice Clerk in Scotland gave an opinion in a similar case in Scotland. It wasn't police officers, I don't think, in that case. It was a different group or it may have been, but I'm sure you'll be able to check that, where again similar exchanges were being made. And I think that type of culture, if I was a young, very idealistic police officer coming in to want to help, and to find yourself sucked into that type of groupthink at an early stage would be hugely disillusioning. It's not something that I, as a police officer, would want to be part of, or to have to deal with these people during the day. And if that culture is more extensive, as some of these newspapers reports that I see each day, so it might suggest that there are out there, then we do have a very big problem, certainly in my context here in England and Wales, and I'm sure it's not isolated to England either.
Thank you. And in relation to, obviously you've prepared a number of reports, we've looked at those today.
Yes.
In relation to all of those reports, but in particular the one regarding Police Scotland in 2020,
yes.
Can you share your impression of the response that you've had to your recommendations and your suggestions about how the police service in Scotland in particular could be improved? What's been the attitude to that?
Generally very accepting and very positive. I think the last one I did, the Police Federation, were not terribly enamoured. But certainly I gave evidence to the Scottish Parliament and to the politicians who seem to fully accept the reports. The problem is that when people like myself are asked to do these reports, you're asked to do the report, and once you've done the report, your task is complete. So there isn't, and I think this is something which people might want to consider for the future, and His Lordship might want to consider, is that a mechanism for not just simply commissioning the reports which take place, but also a mechanism for measuring how the government and various other agencies actually then implement those recommendations which they have accepted at the time, but to actually see what's happening and measuring that. I think that's an important second aspect of commissioning inquiry reports, which I think at the moment is quite weak.
Thank you. Would you allow me one moment, please, Lady Angiolini? Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Lady Angiolini, would you bear with me for a moment while I check whether there are any applications for further questioning? Are there any Rule 9 applications? One. So I'm going to hear an application, Lady Angiolini, so if you would just wait, the staff will liaise with you, and
Thank you.
We'll come back to you as soon as I can.
Thank you.
Lady Angiolini, are you still... No, she's been removed now. That's fine. Yes, not the appropriate description. Ms Mitchell.
The one issue that I want to ask about is the question of the accountability of PERC. In the report, it's clear that Lady Angiolini considers that PERC's aim is to secure public confidence in policing in Scotland. She says so in terms. And she also talks at paragraph 1417 about complaints about PERC as an organisation or the commissioner and who they're made to, that being PERC in the first instance. Thereafter, if a member of the public, which must of course include families of people that the PERC are investigating the death of, is dissatisfied with how their complaint has been handled, any complaint of maladministration by the PERC can be reported to the SPO. And she points out that in order to make this more robust, the ability to complain has to be highlighted more prominently by PERC, and that the complaints process in respect of PERC should be made clear and explicit and by PERC and any relevant information. So she clearly considers that the ability to complain against in relation to PERC is important. And my question to her is, in the case of Mr. Bio, part of the issue in relation to how the family interacted with PERC is that there was little flow of information from PERC to the family. And this may be the same with the other people where there's an investigation in relation to the death of a man in custody. This left them in a position where they simply didn't know what was going on, and indeed didn't really know until the PERC report was disclosed as part of this inquiry process. So the question would be for Lady Angiolini, does she have any suggestions as to how it could be assisted for the family to be able to interact with PERC? And what information could be given, for example, to the legal representatives of families of the deceased? For example, would it be appropriate for those representing the family to be allowed an opportunity to see the PERC report? And might that assist with the Article 2 obligations on PERC?
Yes, well, I shall allow you to explore that. So if you can move your positions, and if we can have Lady Angiolini back on, please.
Do I need to? I think I maybe should stay there.
Lady Angiolini, Ms Mitchell, KC, who represents the families of Sheku Bio, has some questions for you. Ms Mitchell.
It's just one issue that I'd like to ask you about. In your report, you make it absolutely clear of the importance of PERC's aim to secure public confidence in policing in Scotland. And as part of that, you reference the complaints procedure with PERC. And I don't need to take you to it, but for the purposes of the record, it's paragraphs 1417 of your report. Essentially, that details, Milady, complaints about PERC and how complaints are handled and why you think it is important in terms of public confidence that it is made more explicit as to how to deal with complaints, and that they should be more public about how complaints should be handled. In the case of the bios, in this particular case, part of the issue in relation to making a complaint is that the flow of material from the PERC in relation to the family, particularly in this case where there's an investigation of a death of a man in custody, was very limited. And this left them in a position where they simply didn't know how things were being handled. They had, as you've reflected on, in other cases, a lengthy delay in respect of how long things were taking, in respect of what was being done. And my question is this: against that background, do you have any suggestions as to how this could be assisted? For example, could information be given to the legal representatives of families of the deceased, for example, the PERC report, after it's gone to Crown Office?
Yeah, I can understand why during in the investigation, at the point of which presumably there is still the prospect that there may be a potential for criminal proceedings, that you would want to keep the information as close as possible in the event, against the danger of it leaking out, and therefore prejudicing the accused or a fair trial and the whole thing becoming unravelled. So I think if you have a high level, that you have a death of this nature, presumably criminal proceedings would have been one, it would be one potential option that would be considered regarding if you have the death of an individual in these circumstances. And it may well be for that reason that the Crown would be reluctant to give evidence out at an earlier stage. Whether or not you're proposing as an option is not something I've thought about before, but in some continental jurisdictions, I think the defence get information early on the premise that it will be held absolutely confidentially. And I refer to the defence here rather than the family of the next kin in error. But I think that I'd have to think it further through about the balancing the risks. But if it could be shown to work and that solicitors were bound again, like with the peril of being struck off if they disclosed the information out with that, then I think it's possible that that could be done, and I think it is, because I think it's incredibly difficult if you have a very long period of not knowing what's happened. I should say, though, in most death cases, the prosecution should be, in the event, keeping the family up to date with what is happening, and again, giving them as much information as they possibly can. And very often, it was a case that the families should be trusted to have information to be kept in private. The difficulty about giving information out is, should someone make a confession, which of course discloses something which only someone at the scene of the crime would have known, then if you have disclosed the information to third parties, that could have a deleterious effect on the case. But so there are cautions around that.
Absent a special knowledge confession, would you think that there would be merit in exploring the possibility of encouraging greater flow of information to families of people that have been killed in custody from the park after any report goes from the park to the Crown?
Yes.
Lady Angiolini, thank you very much for giving evidence to the inquiry. I appreciate how busy you are with your current report, so I'm grateful for your time. The inquiry is going to adjourn now, and the team will liaise with you.
Thank you very much, my lord.
Allow you to leave. We'll adjourn now till Tuesday at 10 o'clock.